Because they're looking for like a certain piece of like research and things like that. Like
But my
that's
approach
not-
has always been with my back and stuff.
Like they're saying, like yours is more like.
So I've learned yoga to
like,
self-manage it, meditation, all kinds of like stuff. Traction, self-manage, so I used to be a person that, if you couldn't identify the problem, solve the problem, I didn't want to talk to you. The older I've gotten, the more I know, especially with something like this. I'm not gonna fix it. Yeah, it's all about management, and it changes my life. Swimmer to be able to use yoga as a way to stretch before it really started to change.
Because I was.
So it's a cool.
Yeah,
you look
If you need
Try to get a little more.
For my midterm.
yeah, I think,
And then it'll be this class.
I think it's
and then
helpful
after
for
that,
you to have
like,
to through experience with us. That's healthcare technicians, so something different. So
I know, I.
you can always just call and ask, just get on the calendar.
Yeah,
Maybe it can.
I'm surprised Mark's not.
I replied. At least it's just.
Should pop up.
That I was gonna upload some
Yeah,
stuff, but
should.
my.
So the one in the lower right
A lot longer than I wanted.
is referring to us, or is referring to our meeting?
Yeah, it's, there's one participant.
Yeah, I can reserve it.
And that's us.
And everything else.
Yeah, we
Okay.
have, these ones.
I'm not available for this class on Thursday.
Okay,
So I will-
yeah, so we're looking at tomorrow sometime. I'm pretty much open up until 3:30 is when I have my class. And then
How are you?
I'll-
CNR would be nicer because we have closed.
19H.
I can,
No, because we have closed class after, so.
Right.
So I have to walk from the library.
Whoa, you got stitches in the back of your head, dude?
What? You got stitches in the back there? I got a little.
Oh.
I got my hair cut last week at the guy
Kind of.
Oh, no, so you just went ahead and got it. Hey, Lovina, how are you? Very nice to see you.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it's like, gosh, you forget how fun it is to park on campus when you don't have a.
Well, you know what, I was gonna ask you about that yesterday, but then I thought, oh, no, Lovina knows that.
Yeah. No, I knew it, but then I was like, oh, I'll park anywhere, and then I like, I'm sure that
I just wanna know where you're gonna park.
it's.
We could've got you a free.
I know that's kind of late, but that's.
No, so I can be late, the only problem is my late is gonna be like after like 8:30.
That's right. So we have one
Because
student.
I have class 3:30 to 5, and then I work 2 to 5 to 7, and then I have something going on. He's on the road 7 to 8.
I mean, I don't have a problem with shutting out.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, and me.
I imagine it'll take.
I get out of class.
A little bit.
Okay,
So,
I have my slides barely done, but I know that your guys' slides are my slides,
Yeah.
so I don't wanna be like an asshole.
Yeah, I don't know, it's like, it's hard, because I'm just, I have no.
Can you hear me?
I have some.
Yeah, Mark, we can hear you.
I'm gonna talk today. and-
Bye.
Can you see me?
Yeah, no, we can't see you.
Yeah, so, yeah, so I'm gonna talk to you today, and then, so. do you plan on meeting?
That's not probably, that's the
That'll
important
give
thing.
me a little bit enough time to.
You're on.
drive back.
Okay.
What do you want to do?
Just library,
I'm gonna turn some light on.
And then.
either that or like stuff.
Probably library was close.
But you guys can hear me and I can hear you guys.
Yeah, you'll probably want to mute, Mark, unless you have a question.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Did I get it right? Did I? You wanna get on the contact?
First try? Yeah, sure. I can write it there.
Be Lovina. Yeah.
If you guys are able to find a little bit,
Yeah.
I can work on maybe starting some new slides.
Okay. So with one person listening in, slides, that's what you want to talk about, right?
Yeah.
Great. Steve, you want to introduce her?
Sure, happy to.
Great.
So Micah invited Lovina to join us. She comes from the Palouse Conservation District. Anybody not know what a conservation district is? It's okay. Yeah, okay, good. So there you go. I asked her to cover a little bit of what kind of organization she's in, so you could put that up against the other kinds of organizations that you're hearing from. So this is not a land trust. This is kind of a quasi-governmental organization. So more about that from Lovina. Just on a personal, professional note, Lovina, I've known Lovina for probably
Let's see,
12 years or something like that.
15.
15? Who's
Yeah.
counting? 15 years, and both of us in various kinds of positions, but all kind of rotating around the College of Natural Resources. One of the things very special about Lovina is that she lives and breathes this space between science and people in the real world trying to get jobs done. So that's the position that she occupied at the University of Idaho in the Range program. She's did remarkable things, teamed up with Karen Launchbaugh. How many of you know Karen Launchbaugh in Range? Yeah, they were quite the one too. But then she decided that she'd had enough of the good life in university, and off she went to the Conservation District. So it's really a pleasure for me to give you an opportunity to meet Lovina. And yesterday on the phone I told her that you all would do best if she kind of picked at you and kept you in a conversation with her as she's going along, so she's probably going to try to do that. Don't reserve yourselves. If you have a question or if you have a comment, climb right in. Lovina's great at conversation. And anything else you want to add to that from your perspective, Master Restoration?
No, I think that's wonderful. I have some questions I'll reserve for later. Thank you so much for being here.
For sure. No, happy to be here. So
Just one quick note before you go forward. I have right here a study guide for you for the exam. Okay, so those of you that know me from previous classes know, I think Micah has the same philosophy. We're not looking at how well you memorize. We're looking at the information that we really think you need to know to be successful. We're trying to help you be good at knowing that. So the study guide basically covers the landscape in the midterm, which is already written, okay? It's open book, open notes. Takes place in this classroom, 12:30 to 1:45, okay? So it's best if you're prepared. Don't expect to just come in and look at your book, find all the answers or your notes. This study guide will really help you understand what the questions are, things you need to study, all right? If you have questions about that, you can ask Micah and I. There may be a little time at the end of the day today. If not, you know how to find us between now and Tuesday, all right? You want to say anything about the field trip on Friday and whether another foot of snow might have anything to do with
So we will probably be tromping around in the snow again, given the current forecast. Please be prepared for that. We're going no matter what. Just cross your fingers that it's snow and not rain. And we definitely want you to bring your field notebooks because we're going to be starting to get to know that property more intimately and making some sketches and doing our SWOT-C analysis on potential projects. So I think that's all I have to say about it. Just please be prepared, and it'll be about 2 hours. We'll get you back here on time.
So that's your question? Yeah. Did you have something else you were going to say about this?
No, I was just going to encourage you all to look this over sooner than later, and if you feel like you missed something or want to talk to us, come see us during office hours or make an appointment. We're more than happy to spend the time with you to get you prepared.
Lovina, it's great to have you with us.
Well, it's great to be here, you guys. Thanks so much for having me. And I'll just add a little bit to my introduction, too, there, that, again, Steve and I have known each other a good long time, but I'm a double graduate of the University of Idaho. I came here as a transfer student in my undergrad to start on my master's degree project in 2003, so I've been in the area since that time, and then ended up getting my bachelor's degree in the College of Natural Resources, and then articulated right into a master's program, and had the opportunity to work on campus following my master's degree, so kind of have a diverse work background and know a lot of people on campus because of my time working both in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and then spent the last 12, 13 years of my career in the College of Natural Resources working in the Rangeland Center. and then have been at the Conservation District just a year. So it's interesting because I spent a lot of time in the classroom as an instructor, but to come back in a year later and have only been in this job, I feel like when you get into the world of conservation work, what you realize is that it takes probably at least a couple of years to kind of wrap your head around jobs, and there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of crossover between different focus areas, and like I mentioned, I have a range degree, but it really set the groundwork for understanding a really good scope on soils, plants, natural landscapes and resources, and kind of that holistic picture from an ecology lens. And now I get to get out on the ground and get my hands dirty and work a lot more hyper-locally with landowners. So like Steve mentioned, I'm going to just kind of give you guys a lead through on how conservation districts work and what they are, because I know they can be a little bit of an enigma, and they are kind of a pretty unique organization out there in the conservation world. They offer tremendous career opportunities. I didn't really know about all of the different varieties of employment that were available with the degree. And to be honest with you, the University of Idaho opens doors. Take the time to get to know people outside of the classroom and get time to know people in the different work sectors, because those people will open doors for you. And it's tremendous to have the power of networking. And I would be where I'm at in my career if I didn't put myself in front of people and shake hands. So take full advantage of the opportunities that you have with your instructors in the courses, because they'll know people and can get you pretty networked up. So it was a great experience for me to go to school here and then also to live in the community and now work locally. So my presentation today is going to be really pretty fluid. Like I'm not going to stand up here and give you guys a point by point, heavy laden slides. I'm going to show you pictures, and I'm going to talk to you, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it is to do my job. And like I said, I'm still learning how to do my job, and it takes time. And what I'm really excited about is the fact that I can come in front of a class and give you guys an opportunity to see a different lens on different career opportunities available out there. I think sometimes we get a little hedge-pinned in thinking like if you are getting a certain degree, you only go to work for certain agencies. And what I'm here to tell you is that you just got to throw all that out, maybe with the bathwater, and just start on thinking about what it is that attracts you to a job and what your strengths are. And then you can kind of start to follow career paths just based on what it is that you really are about. Because essentially when you're sitting in the seat of a desk 40 hours a week, you want to be doing something that you're passionate about. And I know that all of you in this class are probably extremely passionate about natural resources, or you would have taken a class. You would have seen that syllabus and been like, that's not for me. I'm going to just move on to something else. So it's exciting to be talking in front of students today that I know have a passion for this kind of work, and I'm excited to share a little bit with you. Just to add on to a little bit more about my background and experience, I first worked for a conservation district when I was in my early 20s. I had graduated from a community college, a local community college in Reno, Nevada, where I had lived for about 7 years. And I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. I had this environmental science degree under my belt and was kind of looking for the next door to open. And that door led to an opportunity to participate in an AmeriCorps program. How many of you guys have heard of AmeriCorps or familiar with what it is? Have any of you participated in AmeriCorps yourselves? Yeah, a few of you. So it's a fantastic opportunity for service learning. What I think took away from it the most is that not only did it really heighten my conservation ethic, but it really tied me to the service ethic. So as much as I can, I try to get out and get on the ground and get a chance to be part of a lot of different things happening locally that I care about. So I was on a restoration crew as just a crew member. We mostly were kind of the dirty end of the shovel kind of folks, right? So I'll show you a couple of pictures of one of the projects that was implemented, and I looked really fondly on those crew members because that was me at one point in time in my life, was just out there getting the work on the ground. And so take advantage of all those opportunities as they present themselves, because it takes some time to get a big grasp on the whole picture. But even serving on a field crew for a season can be really impactful and be a great resume builder. So I got a chance to do a stream restoration project that was kind of a larger kind of landscape scale project where the ultimate goal was water conservation and keeping the soil on the ground where it belonged. So got an opportunity to, as part of the spill crew, to get a lot of willows installed on the ground, learned a lot about bioengineering practices, dug a lot of holes, and had a chance to just kind of see what it was to complete this kind of work. Flip side of that, I come back to it 15 years later, and now I'm the person who's kind of planning these kinds of projects. And working with the landowners is really a tremendously rewarding experience to be able to get that good conservation work put on the ground, but to be a part of it from sort of the formulation of the idea to seeing it cross the finish line. It's really fun. So I did a year with AmeriCorps on the field crew, and then the Conservation District had an opening for a watershed intern, and I had the opportunity to spend about a year in a part-time AmeriCorps position while I was going to the University of Nevada, Reno, studying forestry and range. And that part-time position really afforded me the opportunity to get a lot of exposure to restoration project work. We were doing a big project that had a lot of excavation work. It was hyper designed, so we had a lot of engineered work. So we were working with a geomorphologist and hydrologist and this engineering staff on this elaborate design. And so there's like these different scales of projects. There's these ones that are super expensive, hyper engineered, that are working at the same goals as like some of the other project areas that we work in. They're kind of doing things on the cheap, and they're, we only have a certain amount of money that we can throw at different projects, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the sources of where the funding comes from for our work. But just think about, that the type of restoration projects that you might get exposure to throughout your careers can be all over the board. I'm not sure exactly what all you guys have been exposed to in your class, but there can be things that are, multiple $1 million projects that are trying to address something that is maybe like realigning a whole stream channel, or they can just be a few $1,000 projects, which means just going out and maybe plant some trees and re-silica gradient and using some of the more natural approaches to bioengineered conservation to just get soil where you want it to go and that kind of thing. So I had a decent amount of exposure to the Conservation District and knew what they were, and kind of always in the back of my mind felt like it would be a great career path. And so it's really neat to be kind of back on the back end of that and wearing a different hat. So that's a little bit about me, and it is, again, it's great to be an alma mater and come back here and talk to you guys a little bit about this today. So I'm just going to do a quick overview, and I'm going to make you guys kind of get engaged here a little bit. So first of all, I know not a lot of you probably know what conservation districts are, so I'm going to go into that a little bit. But I think I wanted to take kind of a big step back. Go back in history, talk about where these types of entities came from. So, so the origin of conservation districts, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on. And I want you guys to think about this. So, thinking about what you know, and again, I don't really know what exposure you guys have had to certain stuff. Different environmental laws that have come about throughout the ages as a result of U.S. Congress passing different things. But in terms of conservation districts, there was a pretty pivotal event that happened that really started shaping the way that we look at soil and water conservation districts as a nation. Anybody know what that might be? Yeah.
The Dust Bowl.
The Dust Bowl. Okay. So what do we know about the Dust Bowl?
30s?
Pardon me?
30s?
The 30s, happened in the 1930s, yep. Why did we have a Dust Bowl? And where was it?
Practiced poor agricultural habits and displaced a lot of the topsoil.
Yeah.
Primarily in Midwest.
Midwest. Yeah. Yep.
Then they removed a lot of the grasses that had the root structures that were holding the soil down, and as soon as they started tilling it up, now it became arid soil that can be lifted off of.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. So prairie soils. You guys are right on. Anybody else have stuff to add? So you guys are right on target. So Dust Bowl. We're gonna talk about the Dust Bowl. I'm gonna show you some pictures. Okay, so this is a historic photograph of what the Dust Bowl looked like. So the Dust Bowl was more referring to like a location, but it kind of took on its life of its own definition. So it's now like kind of thought of as like this big event, but it was in the prairies, primarily in the middle part of the U.S. So if you just kind of look straight down the middle slot of the United States, what kind of ecosystem was there before? I think somebody said it was a grassland, right? So we had, in the plains, we have like the short grass, the mid grass, and the tall grass prairies. And they all went under the plow as a result of people moving into those areas and putting them under the plow. And so somebody mentioned poor agricultural practices. So what do we mean by poor agricultural practices?
Not providing windbreaks, not having sediment settles in certain portions of it. Also like cross grading, farming.
Yeah. So those are all things that are things that contributed to it. So when I think about poor agricultural practices, I just think about beating the soil to smithereens, right? So unbeknownst to them, there was a lot of people who had, moved from the eastern United States, where we have a huge amount of precipitation, and then you get into this Midwestern, and it starts to get more xeric, right? It starts to get drier, less amount of rains. It's a grassland as sort of an ecological threshold, so you're not getting into a tree ecosystem. And what do we know about prairie plants? What's something that's really distinctive about grasses? Some of them are very drought resistant, yes. Think about what you can't see, what's happening underneath the soil surface. Root structures, yeah. So prairie plants have an incredibly robust root structure, right? And these prairie plants probably had rooting horizons that were extended down. I mean, we're talking probably anywhere in the realm of like 5 to 15 to 20 feet. Some of these perennial grasses that grow in the tall grass prairie, just a tremendous amount of holding capacity those perennial grasses do. And so they existed and had evolved with very little disturbance other than things like herbivory on the soil surface, fire, and drought. Those are the kinds of periodic things that they could withstand. But think about when those costs started coming, we just shifted an ecological threshold, and those landscapes just got really beat up. And as a result, we ended up with the Dust Bowl. Okay, so talk a little bit about the causes of this ecological phenomenon. Just a little kind of back in timeline. So 1931 was about the time that we started having excessive deep-rooted plowing. We had unmanaged, uncontrolled grazing on these prairie ecosystems that are, these grasslands that are rather delicate, and that soil just absolutely got pulverized. To make matters worse, in 1934, worst drought in U.S. history. It affected, 75% of the states. It was just a really poor drought. So talk about a perfect storm, right? No pun intended. Dust Bowl, perfect storm. Huge amount of soil disturbance and followed by a really significant drought. So that pulverized soil was even more hyperfine because it was just dehydrated. Yeah.
Are these droughts, can you compare droughts from like the 30s to what's going on today with the different like population base and how that like just like the surface has changed? Like how do you compare this being the worst drought compared to like what we see as a drought today?
Well, when we talk about the worst drought of what we saw in the 30s, this was, we'd only been collecting weather data for, the U.S. is a relatively young country. Mm-hmm. And so the weather data probably only dated back to like the late 1800s when there was either probably people who had anecdotal evidence about what was happening with weather patterns. And then you have much more sophisticated weather now, but we are experiencing, certain climatic thresholds with respect to droughts. And I know that there was just here recently another really severe drought in the plains. However, how it compares to the drought of the 1930s, I'm not really certain
Oh, okay.
in terms of amount of precipitation. But the key being here is that we've gotten better about our conservation agriculture practices. So we still have a huge amount of resources that are just thrown towards this whole the episodic events of windstorms. And what environmental policy do you think jurisdicts that? The Clean Air Act, right? So we're mandated by federal laws to make sure that we are doing things that keep that that air quality factor to a level that is healthy for the human population. And if you're in violation, there's a whole regulatory system in place for keeping that soil underground. Whereas back in these early days of the nation, there wasn't necessarily anything along those lines. So, 1935. By this point in time, 100 million acres of topsoil across the landscape had been eroded due to poor land practices. So, it was a pretty big area of the Dust Bowl region, extended all the way from Texas all the way from the Dakotas. April 14th, 1935 was called Black Sunday. And they called this the worst black blizzard. And the reason being is this was just an incredibly severe dust storm, such that the storm actually persisted going to the east, into the eastern states as far as like New York City and Washington, D.C. And I'll add on that just a little bit. So this is another historic photograph just showing the extent of these dust storms in the 1930s as a result of the Dust Bowl and how those kinds of things. So pretty dramatic things happening. So in April 1935, not too long after that Black Sunday, right, U.S. Congress said, hey, wait a minute, we got a problem. Because they're sitting there in Washington, D.C., and here comes this dust storm, right? They see it coming, and they pull back the curtains of the rooms, and they're just looking outside, and they're going, holy crap. And this is soil that's blowing in from the Midwestern states, right? So it traveled all the way across the country because of the notion of these events. President Roosevelt signs into effect the Soil Conservation Act in 1935. And as a result of that Soil Conservation Act, the Soil Conservation Service, which is a division of the USDA, was born. And essentially the same language created the formation of soil and water conservation districts. Anybody know what the Soil Conservation Service is called today?
Natural Resource Conservation Service?
That's right, yeah. So the NRCS is the current modern version of the Soil Conservation Service. So it changed their name back in the 70s, I think, to be a little bit more inclusive of not just soil, but also all of the elements of a natural system, including wildlife and water. By the end of 1935, after Congress had even just passed this act, 850 million tons of topsoil had blown off just in that 1 year, is what estimates say. So just in 1 year, I mean, that's just a huge amount of soil. I don't even know a good way to describe it to you guys, but. So here's a little picture of those farming practices we talked about, right? So I said, what do you think, poor farming practice looks like? Well, they didn't really have a lot of sophisticated equipment, and at that time, they were only doing what they knew to do, which was to cultivate the soil and pulverize it, and then that's how they grew the crops. And we have a lot of sophisticated technologies now that allow tractors and farmers to be able to do very, very low disturbance types of planting and really keep that soil in place. Just a couple more pictures. Here's one showing some of the erosion back in the 30s. This was in Texas. Another farmer just sits on his equipment there, and you can kind of see that soil no more prairie root system there. That just was just bare soil that was just ready for wind to come along and take it. This is a picture of a pretty dramatic picture of erosion across the landscape. This is a stream that had downheaded as a result of being absolutely barren and then carrying really, really high flows. So you can see this man up here sitting horseback. I assume it's a man, might be a woman. Sitting horseback up there on the edge, just for context of how much has been lost.
Just imagine doing a restoration project on that site.
Yeah,
Ever done anything like that, Mike?
kind of like a bomb
It's
just
a
went
little
off.
severe.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Here's some more pictures from the prairies showing the degree of soil erosion. This is a worker from the government trying to measure. They're holding two guys holding the end of the measuring tape, trying to show the depth of that soil erosion. Okay, so just a little background on the Dust Bowl. So there was a particular individual who was incredibly impactful in the evolution of the soil and water conservation districts. I was curious if any of you guys might know who that person is. You've studied natural resources and learned a little bit about some of those key people. Anybody have a guess? Good guess, but not quite. Kind of same time frame. Keep them on a little later.
Pinchot.
Different Pinchot. He fought in the Forest Service. So the Soil Conservation Service was founded by a gentleman named Hugh M. Bennett. He was a soil scientist that at the time was pretty instrumental in getting that Soil Conservation Act passed by Congress in 1935. So he basically spearheaded, his notoriety of his soil science career based on the fact that he was kind of the benefactor of that movement towards getting the Soil Conservation Act going. So he was testifying to Congress in Washington, D.C., and was like, opened up the curtains and look outside, and there's this huge dust cloud. And that's pretty, that's pretty transformative. That'll get Congress to sign some bills. So he was kind of the man behind it. So here he is out visiting the Midwestern states, and obviously probably had a cadre of people out looking at some of the farming practices that were at the source of this Dust Bowl phenomenon we experience. So as a result of this passage of the Soil Conservation Act and the formation of the Soil Conservation Service, at the time in the 1930s, and I think it still exists today, so it's kind of true in both cases, but there was a lot of distrust of the government at the time. And so Congress really saw a need for having local organizations that could help drive this conservation work. And so getting boots out on the ground, working with local private landowners, because essentially 3/4 of the U.S. is privately owned. If you separate out all of our public lands. So the Soil Conservation District law came to be in 1937, and it basically was like divvied out to the states to figure out how they wanted to deal with it individually. So the states had control over how their legislative system worked to be able to determine how they wanted to go forward from there. And so the Soil Conservation District law states farmers and ranchers will be granted the authority to establish districts specifically for conservation of soil and water resources. So conservation districts were born, and they were formed locally, hyper-locally. They were formed by the people who were on the ground, working the land, and had the problems. They saw the need for being able to bring together forming some kind of infrastructure that could address these problems. And so conservation districts are given the authority to carry out all kinds of programs for soil conservation, watershed management, flood prevention, all kinds of different purposes within our boundaries. And a lot of times those boundaries follow county boundaries. So it was pretty easy to just have those types of jurisdictions be cross-translated to conservation districts. So I'm most familiar with Washington now because I work in Washington because I'm over in Pullman. But the conservation district that I work for was one of the first formed in Washington. And I'll talk a little bit more about why. But now in Whitman County, which is Pullman side of the Washington border, in Whitman County there's actually 4 conservation districts, which is pretty unique across the nation. It's maybe really big counties will get subdivided. Whitman County is a pretty big county, but because we have such a diversity of landscapes, because anybody who's traveled from Moscow to Seattle and gone out across the, start getting out into the Scatlands, you know, the land use changes, thereby the challenges of what people have to address locally change. And so, so I'm in the Palouse Conservation District, which is the furthest southeast corner of Whitman County, and then there's 3 others that we share in our county. And across Washington, there's 45 conservation districts total. So conservation districts are in every state, and the territories as well, including the islands. And so they're governed locally. So we have both elected and volunteer people, and they govern the work that we do by they set up like the kind of long-term vision for how the organization works. So so they basically decide what areas are kind of the highest priority resource challenges, and then they often are representatives from those different sectors. So here locally on the Palouse, we have a lot of farming and agriculture. And so my board of directors over Palouse Conservation District is made of mostly farmers. But because we include an urban setting of Pullman, we also have representation from Pullman stormwater, and then we have a few folks who have some different interests. But across the gamut, it's mostly people who are farmers and ranchers. So I kind of stole this just right off of the Washington Association of Conservation Districts website, but just to give you guys a little bit idea of what we are. So one of the things that we kind of hang our hat on is we're kind of the white hat people. We're not regulatory in any way, shape, or form. We don't come out and tell people what they need to do. We're more of like the people who just try to put conservation dollars on the ground to address those resource needs. And when I was talking about the conservation district law and how the states had the opportunity to be able to decide how they wanted to go about it, almost all the states have a branch of their state government that is dedicated towards getting a certain pool of money that comes from the legislature out to the ground. So conservation districts are kind of the conduit for that flow of funding. So here in Idaho, there's the Idaho Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. It's based out of Boise. Terry Morrison's the director, and then she oversees the kind of funding arm that goes out to all the different local conservation districts. So I don't know if you guys had a chance to meet yet with May talk, but their focus is a little bit different than ours, just because they have different people serving on their board, they have different funding mechanisms, and they kind of have to serve in different clauses within each of those states. So, trusted local partners, that's what we are. We're the white hats, which I really like. I wouldn't want to be a regulator per se, because I don't like to be the bearer of bad news. Yeah, local people, we try to, make sure that we're non-regulatory efforts. We're a gateway for landowner access, so we always say that we're financial and technical assistance arm of the state. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Conservation districts work at every corner of the state with landowners from all backgrounds. So whether they're urban or rural, whether they have cattle or they farm, whether they are dairy operators, cranberry farmers, whatever, I mean, we have all. And conservation districts have been around since the 30s, so we're pretty well-established organizations and have a pretty defined infrastructure. And so they're really great organizations to work for because they're looked upon really fondly by most all the partner entities that exist out there, including tribal representatives and then the federal agencies. But also landowners tend to have a pretty good trusting relationship, so it's kind of a win-win from that aspect. So you can have a long track record, but it takes time to build relationships. I'll just add that. It just takes a long time to move forward. Okay, so I'm going to come to the Palouse. So I wanted to just kind of touch base on a couple of things that's unique about the Palouse and talk with you guys a little bit to, I don't know, see if you know where you live. So I have the fortuitiveness also to in the CNR, there's a class called NR 101 that kind of exposes the students in the college to all the different programs offered. Have you guys, many of you guys taken NR 101? And see a couple nods, a couple no ways. Yeah, so freshman level class. I taught the Prairie Lab for a number of years, and of course got a chance to work with Karen Launchbaugh, Jan Raffo, and others on this. So kind of steeped in the Palouse Prairie kind of language. So let's talk a little bit about prairie here. So what, there's a couple of unique things about this landscape. So think about what I talked about the Dust Bowl and where the Dust Bowl happened. What did we say that land used to be? Prairie, right? So a lot of those issues that were faced in the Midwest also were faced here by when we converted to farmland. And when you look out across this landscape and you see all these lovely colors and the rolling hills, it's kind of deceiving because it's a thing of beauty, really. But what we're seeing is a very agroecological system, right? This is a fundamentally transformed landscape. We have less than, some people say less than 1% of the native prairie remaining in this region. And the reason being is that it's an exceptionally awesome place to farm because we just have probably some of the most coveted soils in the world. It's really incredible. And we are the #1 white winter wheat producer in the world. So thinking about the soils, and I love all aspects of soil, so kind of a little bit of geek that way. If you were to go out there into a field and grab a hunk of soil and put it in your hand, move it around a little bit, there's a couple key features about the soil that we have here that is pretty instrumental in the reasons why we have our directive as a conservation district. So what we have is a pretty much a loessl-driven ecosystem. Anybody know what loess is? L-O-E-S-S, loess. Anybody ever heard of it? You've heard of it, but don't quite know what it is? So loess is just a term that is used to describe that it was impacted by glaciers. So this is a former, these soils are sourced from glaciers. And you might ask, well, I didn't know that there was glaciers here in Lovina. Well, there weren't. Maybe at one time there was, but most of the soil that's here has been transported in by wind. This is an aeolian system, right? A wind-driven system. And if you look out across the landscape and you see those rolling hills, it kind of makes sense, right? It looks like some dunes happened. So wind happened. And so we have this ancient glacial lake called Lake Missoula that came out of Montana, had a big ice dam. Ice dam broke, floodwaters came across the landscape, created all of this topography that we have, including the scablands, and the water eventually found its way out to the ocean via the Columbia River and Snake River systems. So that's why we have these kind of tremendous canyon country landscapes that are just fantastically beautiful, but also why we're kind of the way we are. So that all those glacial sediments that were at the bottom of that ancient Lake Missoula eventually were wind transported, just the way that the dominant wind current systems work. So that soil was transported here, right on top of like these ancient basaltic flows. So we have like really, really prevalent basal or basaltic bedrock overlain by this really wonderful soil that is wind driven. And then because this was a prairie ecosystem for so long, we have these like tremendously deep, rich, fantastic soils. Because what do when those prairie plants are going, you think about all those perennial grasses growing, and then their root structures break down, and then they create this really wonderful, organic matter in the soil. So we have this tremendously rich, fertile soil that went under the plow starting in the 1800s. And so to understand about the work that we do here on the Palouse, you kind of have to understand about the region a little bit. So again, remember saying that kind of work hyper-locally. So this is my area that I service. That's actually Kamiak View in the background. So this is probably showing a little snapshot of both Idaho and Washington. It's hard to tell where the state lines are, but so the Palouse. So we have these really wonderful, rich soils that are no longer in prairie and that are under the plow, right? So anybody tell me about the cycle of farming here in the Palouse? When does harvest happen? This is an easy one.
Fall.
Harvest happens in the fall, right? And what is like a typical crop rotation here? What do we grow?
Garbanzos.
Wheat and garbanzos, right? So the typical farm cycle here locally is usually winter wheat, spring wheat, garlic. And winter wheat is planted when?
Winter.
In the winter. Spring wheat's planted when?
Spring.
And when do garlics go in?
Summer?
In the spring too. That was a trick question.
That was close.
Okay, so think about harvest happens, right? Harvest happens. Say let's just talk about wheat, right? So you got wheat stubble out there in the late fall. What happens next?
What I said over there.
Tilling
Why?
to turn up the dirt so that it can be planted.
So
To get
go
us-
ahead.
To get a stubble back in the soil so it can decompose over the winter.
Yeah, so residue, right? So farmers have to deal with, because we're a super productive system here, after we harvest, we have a tremendous amount of stubble standing. And the way that if you guys garden or grow or whatever, you have to try to incorporate some of that back into your soil so that you can get that residue, that biomass kind of breakdown. And in doing so, you inherently stir some of the soil up, right? Okay, then let's shift gears just a little bit. Stay with me here. When do we get precipitation? What's our dominant precipitation?
Snow.
Winter and spring, right? But most of it, winter snowfall, right? So you go from the fall, you turn all your stubble in, bring the soil all up, and then what's holding that soil when the precipitation comes?
Snow.
The snow holds soil for a little enough, right?
Lays on top of it.
Nothing, right? So the nature of our cropping systems inherently is in conflict with the way of our natural cycle progression of the precipitation. So thinking about that, farming practices have come a long way. And I get an opportunity to work with a lot of really innovative growers who are doing some pretty either low till or zero till type of farming. And they told me that 10, 15 years ago, they could have never been able to do so because the technology of their equipment hadn't come around to being able to help them pulverize that residual biomass down to a level of where they could get a seed into the ground. And so for farmers, it's been a long kind of, this is what the legacy of their family did. They plowed the soil out here, got it ready for planting the next seed, and then sometimes they'd come out again, plow it again, run a harrow, run a chisel, before they'd work that soil, work it, and then go in and plant. And so, so what the problem has been historically is that the soil has been left barren at the same time that we have our major precipitation events, and we've had a lot of train wrecks. So I've had people tell me testimonial stories that just kind of like are a little bit scary to think about how, watching their field slough off the hill and into whatever, a road, a neighbor's house, whatever. And I would say that one of the best things I like about my job is I like working with people who are land stewards, that care about being there and wanting to see that soil stay on the ground. So those are the people that come knocking on our door, right? Those are the people who come and talk to us a little bit about what we can do for them. Here's a couple of examples of what happens. So this is probably taken in, I would say it could be any time of year. It could be taken even this time of year. So this was probably planted in the winter. So this is probably winter wheat coming up right here. And because it's planted usually in September, early October, it gets, into that 3 or 4 leaf stage before the snow starts falling. But that doesn't necessarily translate to it having a robust enough root system to really hold that soil in place. So you get things like this. These are just, these are called this is called rill erosion. We have a couple different cascading types of things that are happening. So you can see the rills coming off of this hill here, and then they come in forming kind of like they kind of come together and then they form like this sheet. And those sheets sometimes, those sheets and rills, left unchecked and left unmanaged, they can start to get into gullies. And gullies are where gullies follow the topography of the landscape kind of lower down, and they're trying to find a way for that water to get to where it wants to go. And we have a lot of problems with sheet and rill erosion in the wintertime. This is pretty typical of a farm field. If you look out here right now, and seeing that stuff kind of go down the drain is not what we want to see, because it does nothing for us for keeping our water quality standards where we want them to be. Not to mention that we're losing stuff off the field. So how many of you guys been to Palouse Falls? If you haven't, you should, because it's awesome, it's beautiful. So this is Palouse Falls, right? What's wrong with this picture?
Chocolate milk.
I heard it back there, Steve.
Chocolate milk.
Chocolate milk, right? The Palouse River drains most of our watershed. Actually, here in Moscow, you guys are on a different watershed. Where I'm at, we're on the Palouse River watershed, and it all goes out that way. And chocolate water, right? That's not what we want to see happening in the spring when we have those high flows, but that's all coming off of our farm fields. So these are the kinds of things that we're working to address at the Conservation District. This is just another little, give you guys an idea. I read somewhere that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it wasn't uncommon for fields to be eroding at a rate of like 100 tons per acre per year. 100 tons per acre per year. And so this is a farm historic photo, 1961, at Palouse, Washington. You can see where that corral fence sits. That was 1911. And then this is what we call like a plow line erosion. So wherever that plow's going, it's turning up the soil, And however deep that plow is going, that soil is exposed to it much where it can just move off. So this was 1911 to 1961, so in 50 years, we saw some pretty significant drops in soil. And this is just, 15 miles from here. So wanted to give you a little bit of background on what some of the problems are with respect to the challenges that we face at the Palouse Conservation District. It's just inherent that we have kind of a perfect storm, in that we live in an ecosystem that's severely departed from what it was. We have a strong economy that's based primarily around agricultural production, not unlike anywhere else in Idaho or in Washington for that matter. And so agriculture plays a key role in most of those landscapes that we so care about are being maintained and managed in an agricultural setting. And so, giving some context to that, I'm going to just kind of change gears a little bit, and in the remaining time, I'm going to kind of walk you guys through, well, kind of my job. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit more about what I do and where my thought process is when something comes, when somebody comes in the door and starts talking to us. So, I know there's another kind of companion class that some of my colleagues talk to. So some of you guys got to hear from Stephen Johnson and Janessa Jolson out of my office about the RCPD, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program here for the Palouse watershed. So can I get a show of hands who's in that class? 475, yeah. So a few of you got to see that. So I'm going to not duplicate what they talked about. Actually, I don't even know what they talked about, but I'm going to kind of go in a different direction. But I'm going to talk about sort of a little bit more about a project that I did as part of that RCPP, but I'm going to kind of walk you guys through. And this has been kind of fun for me to reflect a little bit because, like I said, I've only been there a year, and I inherited some projects. I inherited some train wrecks, and that's just part of having a job. It just happens. But I'm going to spend some time on this slide. We're going to have a conversation about this. So, okay, project evolution. How do we go about getting projects in the door and getting work on the ground? So, landowner walks in the door, says, Lovina, I got a problem. Then I say, okay, let's talk. And take them in my office, and then I usually either go out and field or whatever, but most of the time they come into the office. And they probably heard about us, probably from a neighbor, more than likely, because that's usually how the best advocates for the work that we do are the people that we work for. Those landowners are typically the ones that really, really bring us the work. So a lot of times I'll have somebody say, well, I've been talking to my neighbor, and he told me he did, got some cost share assistance, and I want to come in and talk to you a little bit about it. Okay, great. So walk in the door. Can't really do my job without going out and seeing, right? So I got to go do a site visit after I talk to this person. So before I go do a site visit, what can I do for my office?
We have maps or aerial imagery.
Love maps, right? Aerial imagery. I usually try to get a landowner to tell me where their property is, because in my line of work, we have to do a lot of things with respect to not only like a Latin long of a location, but we also have to be able to do legal descriptions in terms of like a township range section, right? So maps are my friend. What else might I do before I go out?
Look into the history on that piece of land. See if
Yeah.
they've had issues in the past.
I haven't thought of that. That's a good idea. Definitely want to look if there's anybody else who's had work done out of our office on the plan. And we have a little bit of a antiquated filing system, so it might sound easier than it really is. I'm going to talk a little bit more about cultural resources, but we have a way to look at historical data. Yeah, that's a good one. Anything else you guys can think of?
What about looking at the surrounding areas?
I'm sorry?
Looking at the surrounding areas?
Looking at the surrounding areas, right? Like maybe topography map or
Or maybe the neighbor has already done something.
looking at what maybe we've done. Yep, that's a great one. So we have a database of all of the projects that we've done. And a lot of times the institutional knowledge in the office might not remember, people who are on staff might not remember. We should have some record of work that has been done either on the property itself or on some adjacent property. And whenever we can work adjacently, man, that's powerful because then you can start to exponentiate your impact by having adjacency. So yeah, that's a great one. Okay, so a couple tools that I have up my sleeve before I do a site visit. How many of you guys have ever heard of web soil survey? You have. Web soil survey is an incredibly powerful resource. I thought about trying to prepare you guys like a little lab review, but I knew I was going to run out of time, so I'm kind of long-winded. And so I figured that the best I can do is that I challenge you to at least Google web soil survey and understand what it is, because it is a tool that is like masterfully positioned to help people in any sector of natural resources. So the web soil survey is basically it's a web-based tool that takes all of the soil survey work that was done by the USDA Soil Conservation Service, and the web soil survey tool has a lot of features that are super useful and handy for somebody like me who needs to get kind of a quick snapshot. So essentially, I can pull up a map. It's an interactive web tool, and I can find a property, and I can just draw like a polygon, just draw an outline of where the property is at. And by doing so, I can take that tool, and it tells me everything about what soil types I'm going to find, and based on those soil types, what their like T value is, what's their erosion value, like how many tons of soil can be lost based on that soil type. It tells me how deep the water table is, so it gives me some understanding of what's happening subsurface that I can't see with my eyes when I go out there. So if I go out to a property and talk to a landowner about something that's happening with respect to like periodic saturation issues, and they've got livestock in that area that I've seen on a map that is a historic floodplain or is just seasonally saturated because we know something about the water table, that's a tool that I know that I have in my back pocket before I go out, right? So soils data is incredibly important, and it can help a lot with understanding too about what kind of challenges you're going to face down the road when you start getting into planning. So web soil survey, hugely, hugely important tool that I use all the time. Other pre-site visit steps, and again, I'm a little bit more familiar with Washington because that's where I work. Washington has a regulatory agency that mandates water quality for the state called the Washington Department of Ecology, DOE. We like to make acronyms out of everything. And so the Washington Department of Ecology has a water quality atlas that is also a web-based interactive tool. And if the landowner expresses to me, oh yeah, I've got this stream going through my property and it floods, or he's telling me something about what it's doing that is troublesome or worrisome, or if he's got livestock, I can look on a water quality atlas map and very quickly get a snapshot picture of what kind of concerns might be present in that water testing, because the state has to go around and test different water bodies. And so by looking at that water quality atlas, I can really quickly get a quick snapshot of what some of the water quality issues might be. So I can see if there's like a category 3 listing. Does anybody know what a category 3 listing for a stream is? So those are designations that trickle down through the Clean Water Act and and down to the states, and the states are mandated to jurisdict those. So a category 3 listing would be where it's explicitly defined as something that needs to be addressed in like a water quality or a watershed plan. So there's kind of different designations or different tiers of designations, and category 3 is the highest designation. That's like the red flag. That's where we're in violation. We're out of the parameters that we need to be in. And so that's where we know that we can, that's where we need to know we need to get something back into focus. And so, so I can look at those tools before I even go out and have a better sense of what it is. And it's actually, frankly, really kind of cool because it takes me like 5 minutes to pull up a web soil survey and then print out a report, and I can take it to the landowner, and it makes them feel good to know something about their properties that maybe they didn't know before. So it's a handy little tool. Okay, so those are kind of some of my pre-site visit, right? I get ready to go. Rule number 1, never rely on Google Maps to try to find anything in the rural setting, okay? But if there's anything I can help you guys understand is that you'll feel really foolish when you have to call landowner like 3 different times because you're lost because you Google mapped it. And I speak from experience. And you can't find it, right? So don't just be like, oh yeah, I'll just Google map it. I'll know where it is. I'll just drive right there. I got my little GPS. It doesn't work that way. So always get good directions on a phone call before you try to set out, because otherwise it can be a little bit challenging. So you have a site visit, you go out. When you have a site visit, it's kind of an opportunity to do a little bit of an interview, but it's also just about listening. It's really about hearing what it is that that landowner has in terms of their objectives for their particular operation. It's all over the board. I mean, but when you really listen and you really start to develop your listening skills, it's actually really rewarding and empowering, because when folks feel like they're listened to, they're willing to share much more with you. And again, you know, they might be a little withholding because they might not trust you yet, and it takes time to build that trust. But the one thing that I can say about a site visit is talk less, listen more. And have the opportunity to really try to build that relationship with that person and try to figure out what it is that your job is, what kind of solutions you can bring to the setting. It's really about just doing that dance a little bit. Okay, so I've gone to the site, kind of heard a little bit about what they think the problem is. They're coming to me for some solutions. They want that technical assistance, right? They're kind of like, need maybe to do something different, but I'm not really sure what it is. And so I have a lot of resources at my disposal in my position that are like technical guides, because I'm going to be the first to tell you that no one person can be juxtapositioned to have the solution just ready at hand. And so a lot of times it's coming back from the field, documenting what you heard, and then looking into what tools you might have available to get you there. So a lot of times people want to do something, but they don't want to do it alone. It's really important for them to have some access to some funding. So I wanted to talk to you really briefly about what we do in terms of funding options. So we're a cost share assistance provider. Can anybody tell me what cost share is? What do you think it is? Just throw it out.
You share the cost with agencies or other people who are willing to fund what's going on.
Partially true, yes. It goes a little deeper than that. Anybody else want to add to what he shared? Cost share. What is cost share? Yeah, so sharing the cost, splitting the cost, project partners. Yeah, so it took me a while to kind of wrap my head around what cost share was, because it's different in every setting. Sometimes in different boards from different conservation districts, they can establish their cost share rate, how much they're willing to provision versus how much the landowner needs to bring to the table. And so it's kind of a unique situation where I work, because we were so anxious to get landowners in the door that we actually provide 100% cost share. So we invite people to get projects on their ground to the tune of like we cover all of those. But a lot of times it's pretty typical for a conservation district to be like a 50-50. So landowner pays 50%, conservation district pays 50% through different funding mechanisms. But what I want you guys to understand about cost share and what's unique about it is that it's basically like baiting the hook, right? It's an incentive. So giving an incentive to get work on the ground with a conservation goal in mind is really what cost share assistance is. So if you can think about it kind of big picture. It's kind of like a payment for an ecosystem service, right? So people are willing to do stuff voluntarily, but only to the fact is if they can be able to, if they can shoulder the burden of the cost. So, so I always try to look at it as we're kind of matchmakers. We're matching up different pools of funding and giving payment to projects or to landowners to benefit kind of the whole, right? To benefit society at a tune of like that payment for ecosystem service. So we get things kind of back to functioning, and then that provides a benefit to society as a whole. So cost share is really unique that way, and it's really interesting to work with. So funding options, we work, again, I mentioned during that conservation district law, the states have the opportunity to try to decide how they wanted to do it. Well, we have an agency in Washington called the Washington Conservation Commission, Washington State Conservation Commission. And it's similar in Idaho, the Idaho Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. The Idaho Soil and Water Conservation Commission is a funding mechanism from the state to get those dollars out of the ground. So I work a lot with state dollars. I work a lot with dollars that come from the regulatory agencies. So like Washington Department of Ecology, their mandate is water quality. And so if they see a problem out on the landscape, they might tell the landowner to come in our office, and we're able to apply to Washington Department of Ecology on a competitive basis to get project funding to be able to address certain things. So again, we're kind of shifting dollars towards the ground to where it works. Sometimes most of those pools of funding are competitive statewide. We also have access to some federal program dollars. I'm not going to spend time talking about those today because they're super complicated. But often the work that you're able to accomplish is largely driven by what the funding source is. And so, again, it kind of goes back to that theme of my matchmaker mode. I match what the challenges are that the landowner is facing, what their objectives are for their conservation work, and I match it to the funding source. And so a lot of times it's about getting different pools of money in the door and pushing it out towards a certain goal. So I talk a lot about soil and water conservation, but we also have a lot of Palouse Prairie projects that are kind of high priority. So we might get funding from like U.S. Fish and Wildlife or Washington Fish and Game that's really targeted, really focused on maybe some native prairie or some wildlife habitat or whatever. So kind of the goals of the project are always kind of matched to the funding. And so in this particular project that I'm going to just show you a couple slides of really quick, I noted what the landowner needed and matched it to some state funding dollars that we had. Okay, so let's go into the coast site visit. So now we've kind of thought through things. We've got, okay, we know this particular problem exists. We know the landowner is voluntarily wanting to do something about it. Let's get, we have some money. And so then you're kind of, that's where the majority of the work starts. And this can be a really long-term process, but a lot of times, because of the way the funding works, you might have like an end date of like, because fiscal cycles for the state work differently. The fiscal budget might end June 30th. And so like landowner walks in the door, like say today, I have till maybe June 30th only to get this project funded and out the door. So sometimes it can be really, really fast tracked and you're working really like, oh my gosh, I gotta get this done. And you might not be able to be as thorough as you'd like. And then sometimes you have a little bit more time to think about things and a little bit more time to plan. So then you kind of go into this post-site visit steps, which you kind of enter into the planning phase. I'll show you guys a couple planning maps, nothing big, but basically planning is where you use some of the tools that we have available to assess the situation. And then part of that assessment process is making sure that the work that we're going to do is meeting the laws and regulations and policies that are in place. So things like the Clean Water Act, the environmental, the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, and things of that nature. And so we come up with a design and plan. Before we can go anywhere and do any work, we have to consider cultural resources. So this was a really new segment to me, and it's governed by the National Archaeological and Historic Preservation Act. So again, we have another policy that's mandating what we do before we go out and get on the ground. Permitting, I do a lot with permits. to be able to do projects in waterways. And so that can be a really complicated beast. And I won't spend a ton of time on it, talking about it today, but it's a strong consideration because this cog moves really slowly because it has to go through a lot of different hands and a lot of different agencies. So when you're going through this process, certain things can go kind of expedient and then other things really slow down. Cultural resources and permitting can take anywhere, between like 2 to 6 months. Before we get to work, after, it's not just a handshake deal, this is an actual contract between us and the landowner. So we have these kind of elaborate cost share documents that we, and contracts that come forward, and they get signed by the landowner, they get signed by our board, and they go into effect for a certain period of time. And before we can do any work, we have to have those in place. And then we go into construction phase, and then we have kind of post-construction or maintenance phase. And so this was me just kind of brain dumping and kind of getting this down. And I just have a couple of pictures to show you guys about kind of what this looks like. So I visit this landowner, I look out here, man, what do we got going on here? What a mess, huh? So we've got a waterway, right? What else does it look like we have?
Segregation, cattle.
We've got some livestock in the waterway, right? So we've probably got some overuse, some trailing. What else do you think we have going on? What's happening in the adjacent uplands? Hard to see from this picture. We've got some pastures, and then adjacent to the pastures, we've got farm fields, we've got a hay pasture. So we've got some irrigation going on over here. You can see these irrigation heads going. So, and then you see these trails that are coming down to the creek. So this is a situation where I was working with a landowner who had unrestricted livestock access to the waterway and had some pretty challenging erosion issues going on. So this was kind of a water quality red flag, a soil conservation red flag, a animal and livestock operation kind of red flag. He didn't have any off-stream water. So we've so this is just kind of an overview of like one of my plan maps. So this was through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. So we focused explicitly on soil and water conservation and wildlife habitat. So this was an upland area that we planted. I went in and we planted a bunch of plants. We put in some fence. We got the livestock off the creek. So here's our field crew planning and repairing forest buffer. We've got the fabric down for weed control because we have to consider how we're going to control weeds. Had a contractor come in, put in a fence. We've got the guy out there haying at the same time that we're building the fence. Got some livestock water put in and got the fence to keep them out of the waterway. And this was an interesting, this is my last slide, but this was an interesting little pipe bridge that caused us some permitting issues because we tried to put a structure over the waterway. And so I guess in the take-home message is that, in general, the project workflow can be kind of too robust to cover in a short period. But I just wanted to kind of brain dump a few ideas on you guys. And this project now is just in wrap up, and we'll go out this spring and do some maintenance on it to make sure that the plants stay alive and that the landowner is doing the settings. So could have talked a lot more about a lot more project stuff, but for the sake of time, I know I needed to kind of wrap it up. So kind of took us right to the end there.
That's outstanding, thank you. One question for you.
Yeah.
You mentioned there are how many conservation districts in the state of Washington?
In Washington, there's 45.
So do you ever attend meetings or conferences, either statewide or regionally, to exchange ideas amongst districts?
We have a meeting every summer called the Washington Association of District Employees. And it is conservation district staff from across the state that come together. And we also have a couple of regional meetings, one here in Eastern Washington that we attend. And so we do get an opportunity to do idea sharing. The national organization is called the National Association of Conservation Districts. They just had their annual meeting last month in Memphis, Tennessee. And 2 people from my office attended.
That's fun.
Do you actually label any of your projects restoration? Is that an acceptable term for agricultural producers? You're clearly doing that in the example you showed.
Yeah, yes and no. That's a complicated question, because restoration maybe implies going back to something that was there before. And we're in a situation in the landscape where we're so departed, like that waterway that's on this place, it's been channelized, right? It's been straightened, and it basically is functioning as a ditch. And you have to work within what the landowner is willing to do. And he's not willing to give up his hay ground or his livestock pasture. He was willing to give us a little buffer so that we could buffer what was going into the waterway and to try to create some plantings. But we're never going to get that meandering system back, because that's what streams naturally want to do, is be sinuous, reach their barriers, get out into their floodplain. And so restored, no. Functional, kinda. Addressing the major red flags is really more, I mean, there's different areas that we work in, but red flags, I put out fires.
Micah,
Yeah.
on Friday or even on Thursday if we have time, it might be a good idea, just because of that, we'll verve there. If you talked a little bit more with them about the design approaches, because that's the space she's standing in there, that'd be really good.
Great.
We'll talk more about that.
Well, thanks for your attention, you guys.
Lovina,
Great
thanks
Thank you
very
so
much
much.
for joining.
Thank you.
If you all have any questions, I know we ran out of time, but Lovina would be happy to talk to you individually, I'm sure.
Yeah, my contact info, feel free to drop me a note or give me a call. You can Google me at the district. Happy to talk to you guys.
That's it.
Get everybody? Okay, so if you have questions about things that are on this sheet, let us know, okay? I tried to make them brief, but they should all be, they're all pretty much code to take into account. It's great. That ending place was right where Mike and I were. You were just, you may not use that.
Yeah. Just that whole review, shadow, like that, restoration, reclamation.
Yeah.
So if you want
Yeah,
to.
this is
just gonna be reading through it.
Yeah.
It's a long way.